Hey, Tessa.
You want to get some paper out so you can flow the round? We're just about to start.
Can I do it later, like tomorrow?
Are you coming tomorrow too?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure. That works.
Okay.
If it makes me feel better, do you want me to go?
No, it's okay, I could. Why does it have to be inevitable? Right. You guys? Time starts. I strongly affirm today's resolution that the United States federal government should implement a cap-and-trade policy. First, briefly, for some definitions, a cap-and-trade policy is one that sets an economy-wide limit on how much carbon can be emitted from pollution, from generating electric power, natural gas, transportation, manufacturers, etc. And within this limit, companies first enter into an auction to determine how much of these allowances of carbon they get. And once they hit the allowance, they either have to stop emitting or they pay a large fine, or they can seek to buy allowances from other companies that did not use up all of theirs, as they are allowed to be selling them to these other companies in order to make a profit off of emitting less carbon overall. So in the context of this resolution, our plan is for the United States federal government, as soon as possible, no funding necessary, to create this cap-and-trade policy in order to achieve a 20% reduction at least from current levels of carbon emissions by 2020. By setting this cap-and-trade policy, establishing an auction for these allowances immediately for all major companies in the United States, and allowing for this trading of the carbon emission allowances as soon as the initial allowances are all auctioned off. Yes?
So how much money is each specific unit going to cost?
As of now, it is set with an auction, with the base prices the same as it is set in Europe, so that it can interact with what is going on in Europe with their cap-and-trade policy.
So it's going to be joined with Europe, like cap-and-trade with Europe as well?
It's just set so that they can economically interact and be competitive with each other. And with this in mind, as is the precedent with the policies in California as well as in Europe, the money earned from these auctions will be used on United States environmental policies, as that is where it has always previously been used. The criterion for this debate should be net benefits, and now moving into the affirmative points. Our first is that establishing a cap-and-trade policy helps to incentivize cleaner technology. Right now, having green technology is extremely expensive and unprofitable for companies within the United States. Thus, by creating this cap-and-trade policy, we reward companies that are already doing it because their emissions will be below the allowances and they don't have to buy as many allowances, as well as the fact that if they implement cleaner technology after already buying these allowances, they can easily sell the excess ones because they did not use as much carbon as they predicted they might need to. So we see that we're rewarding companies who are already very good for the environment, as well as encouraging them to come up with cheaper ways to be more efficient about their use of carbon, as well as more cost-effective overall. So we see that the impacts of this are, first, that it'll be overall helping the environment, as we see that within 20 years, the world as a whole will cross a brink beyond which the feedback loops will require or will lead to the United States and the world as a whole going into a downward spiral of temperatures rising, sea levels rising, all interacting together to create more global warming and climate change that after that point is very unlikely to be reversible, thus creating this type of spiral where it will be impossible to turn around the effects of climate change after this point. By implementing a cap-and-trade policy and reducing carbon emissions to such an extent just by 2020, as with all cap-and-trade policies, the amount of emissions then going down even further after that point, we see that will help to turn around this system so that we no longer enter into these feedback loops and can continue to stop the effects of climate change in our world today. Secondly, we can see that it will have an economic incentive for this to actually work, which means it will be far more effective at preventing these environmental harms, because companies are driven by money. So when we give them a monetary incentive to use less carbon and to create cleaner technology, they're far more likely to do so, which means we're far more effective at combating the overall increase in carbon emissions. which has bad impacts of leading to sea levels rising, which displaces millions of people, as well as creating a lot more land that is no longer usable for food production, and thirdly, by preventing ocean acidification, which also results from more carbon in the atmosphere. And because of all this, it is clear that cap and trade will help to prevent these bad impacts and overall help the environment of the world as a whole. Our second point is that cap and trade specifically will also help the economy in addition to helping the environment. Right now we can see that there are rising costs due to environmental damage, specifically through what is called the social cost of carbon, which is the cost we see because of carbon emissions as seen through property damages due to risk of floods, through risk to human health, through different costs of energy, through other impacts that we see because of more carbon going into the atmosphere. We see that right now there's a social cost of carbon of $2.15 trillion every single year, which is a huge amount of money that is being wasted because we have not cut down on these emissions. We see that through implementing a cap and trade policy would help to combat that. As we see through analyses of the California policy applied on a larger scale to the entirety of the United States, it would save an overall $1.5 to $1.7 trillion by 2050. But the cost of it would only be $600 billion to $1 trillion. Meaning, at the very least, a profit of $600 billion from implementing this policy because we are preventing the social cost of carbon, preventing the types of pollution that we see in our world right now. So we see overall that we're helping the economy by creating this profit margin within the United States, which means more people, more businesses are making money that they can spend in the economy, which means leads to more jobs, more people having enough money to get an education, get the necessities they need, etc. Overall, increasing the quality of life here in the United States. We see as well as another impact that by having this more preventative policy of helping to prevent carbon emissions before they have an impact on society, we'll be better able to reduce healthcare costs due to these carbon emissions, due to the pollution that is currently being a drain on our healthcare system. And finally, third, we see that the cap and trade policy is far easier than other policies to create an international precedent. This is because since it is economically beneficial and is far easier to implement than many other forms of environmental policy, it can actually be done in other nations where the concerns about it taking too much money or being too much of a drain on the economy are far bigger than they are here in the United States. We see, for example, India and China, which are very against having any sort of environmental policy, first of all, because the United States is not doing it, and thus they see the U.S. as a hypocrite for requesting it, and secondly, because they want their economy to continue growing. However, a cap and trade policy in the United States solves both of those problems, which means we see the impacts of these policies worldwide, overall far less carbon being emitted, and overall reducing the effects of climate change not just in the United States, but worldwide as a whole too. And for all these reasons, I strongly affirm.
So just as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to go aft case, then I'm going to go contentions or detriments of the aft case, and then move on to counterplan benefits. Okay, so is everyone ready? Okay, so time begins now. So we negate today's resolution, the USFG should implement a cap and trade policy. So moving on, first we agree with their framework, and they didn't really provide a criterion for this debate, so we believe that, oh you did? Sorry, then never mind. So moving on to their plan, they say that they're going to reduce carbon emissions by 20% by 2020, and this just seems like some arbitrary amount that they really didn't give any justification to. Why exactly 20%? Is this even viable? Do they have any statistics, it's protected time, showing that 2020 is the ideal, it's protected time. Ideal. But moving on is that they say, and then moving on, their entire actor and their agency is flawed. And as well as their funding, they say that they need no funding, but there's a myriad of logistical issues with implementing the cap and trade policy. Exactly who's going to monitor all of these carbon emissions? Are we going to create an entire system to make sure that it's all even? Who's going to create this auction of finding exactly how much these caps are going to cost? I'll take your question later. Sit down. Okay. So moving on, who's going to monitor this? Who's going to enforce every single billions of corporations in America to ensure that they all produce within the limit? We don't even have a carbon emission measuring system in place right now. There's no federal standard right now, so they're going to have to come up with that. Moreover, is that they have to address faulty reporting. Simply put, no funding is this entire plan is logistically impossible. But moreover, they have no guarantee whatsoever. When I asked them about how much these cap and trade units are going to cost, they said that we're just going to coincide with Europe and it's going to be by auction. However, they provide no guarantee whatsoever that these allowance costs are going to outweigh the costs of corporations producing less. For example, if it's going to cost me $5 to move to sustainable energy, but it's only going to cost me $1 to keep emitting carbon, obviously I'm going to keep emitting carbon. As my opponents already said, these corporations are driven by profit and by economically, and they have no guarantee whatsoever that this plan is going to logistically work out, no enforcement authority whatsoever, no measuring authority, and really just no economic guarantee. So moving on to their first contention, they talked about how it's going to incentivize green technology, but again, there's no guarantee that people are going to move to green technology when the movement to green technology costs far more than just staying and emitting carbon as we speak. But secondly, they talked about an economic incentive on how this is going to actually allow corporations and the U.S. government to profit. No, it's going to give these corporations an economic incentive to outsource to other countries. Already we see in the status quo the continuous pattern of corporations moving to other countries because of lax regulations on the environment. This whole cap and trade problem is simply going to further exacerbate this kind of problem. My opponent came up here and they already said India and China don't have any regulations on carbon, and that's true. And that's what's going to happen is that when the United States limits all of these corporations and factories' carbon emissions, what's going to happen is that they're going to be economically driven to move to China and India, where they can pollute all they want and even more and actually gain more of a profit. Yes.
Are you aware that India and China have both actually implemented some environmental policies along this line, but are reluctant to do more until the United States does so?
Okay, actually, you just said that they didn't. So, but even so, like India and China already have less environmental regulations than the United States, and if the United States pushes this carbon cap and trade policy, like obviously it's going to be even more regulations, and these corporations are going to still move to China and India. Furthermore, I think you're talking about the Kyoto Protocol, about the whole cap and trade policy. Also, China and India are actually exempt from all of these cap and trade policies mandated by the Kyoto Protocol. So even though they signed it, they're actually exempt from doing it, so they haven't actually implemented anything. So I'll take your question later. Also, social costs. So they're essentially all three of their contentions right on the fact that this actually works, but internationally we can see that cap and trade programs haven't actually been successful in the past. For example, Canada. In 2005, Canada tried to reduce their carbon emissions by 15%, and hundreds of billions of dollars later, and 5 years, they actually increased their carbon emissions by 122% because it is still economically profitable to emit more carbon than it is to change to better energy. So moving on to our counterplan, actually, our actor is going to be the United States federal government. Our time frame is going to be as soon as possible. Funding, well, there really is no funding necessary. So instead of this entire singular focus that my opponents have on cutting carbon emissions, what we're going to do is that we're going to have the U.S. federal government focus on other greenhouse gases, specifically methane, ozone, and aerosols, and push for a 30% reduction from 1995 levels. And there's actually two benefits from this. First of all, it's going to be much more effective than creating a cap and trade program without all of the hassle, without creating an entire department to regulate it. Yeah.
Is this a similar cap and trade type policy, or is it a tax?
Oh yeah, I'll move on to specific things. But what we're going to do is that we're actually just going to mandate that all of these specific sectors that are implementing it cut it by 30%, and the United States federal government is going to do a myriad of things. I'll explain the specifics in my contentions. Okay. So moving on. So our first benefit is that it's actually going to be much more effective than the carbon trade cap and trade program. According to NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, reductions in other greenhouse gases, for example, aerosols, are a far more practical way to reduce global warming. And this is because these greenhouse gases are far more detrimental and actually contribute much more to climate change than carbon dioxide does. Studies show that climate change by non-CO2 greenhouse gases was 1.4 watts per meter squared, while CO2 was just 0.2 watts per meter squared. So we see that non-CO2 greenhouse gases are the primary driver of global warming. So all that my opponents are doing with the reduction of carbon dioxide, while it's noble tool, it's really not going to have any effect whatsoever. And we see that every 1 metric ton reduction of non-greenhouse gas emissions is actually 7 times more effective in stopping climate change and global warming than a reduction in CO2 is. So moving on to my opponent's question on how exactly we're going to do it, is that we're, for example, in reducing specifically the methane, what we're going to do is that we're going to create better irrigation management and solving for leaky natural gas lines in the United States through the pipelines, and that's going to cause a 30% reduction in methane. And then specifically for ozone, what we're going to do is that we're going to change the fertilizer types that don't actually have ozone, and that's going to reduce another 30% of the ozone, and that's the 2 specific plans that we're going to do. And essentially this is going to cost 1/6 the amount of because non-greenhouse gas emissions are far rarer, and these are obviously much simpler solutions, like solving for leaky natural gas lines is a much simpler solution than creating an entire carbon cap and trade program. And we can see actually that this plan, contrary to their plan, has worked in other countries in the past. In 2015, China and India actually agreed to completely phase out their entire chlorofluorocarbon production, or the CFC, production, and it only cost $232 million, and all they had to do was tell the factories to stop doing that. So as you can see, we should negate. Yeah. Yeah.
Why the heck she purchased roofs and so similar, and then she says, and then she spends 2 minutes bashing cars? I don't know. It was a bit of a waste of time. Who cares? Why waste your time? I mean, I don't know. Why'd you waste 2 minutes bashing our normal means plane and do it for your own?
Nobody cares about normal means.
Oh, because it worked when we tried to do the whole like a certain yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you guys put on framework a ton.
It was like 2
It
minutes.
was more like planned.
Why even bother with this? Like, honestly. Okay.
Like under fiat, it would work.
Okay.
As a member of the affirmative team, I strongly affirm today's resolution that the U.S. federal government should implement a cap and trade policy. So the negation team comes up here and they spend 2 minutes talking about our plan, pointing out a bunch of different problems with their plan, supposedly with our actor and our funding. There's one answer to this, Judge. We're going to be doing this through normal means. My partner stated this in her speech. There's no reason that we need to waste any more time talking about this plan at all. Now, the first negation speaker comes up and tells us, well, it's not viable to do 20% reduction. There's no justification for this number at all. Now, the specific reason for a 20% reduction is that we can achieve an 80% reduction, which we need by 2050. And yes, this is actually a really viable level. So, yeah. Okay, it's the first one. It's the first level set by international climate agreements. Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay, so seeing as the United States hasn't ratified the Kyoto Protocol, nor hasn't ratified the Paris Agreement,
The Kyoto
why
Protocol is not the
Can I
only
finish my question? Can I finish my question? Thank you. Thank you. So why exactly are we suddenly going along with all of these regulations when the United States
We're creating new
Why don't we
environmental
just sign the
regulations that are
Kyoto
going to
Protocol
be able to set a new. Okay,
Signing the Kyoto
Protocol doesn't do
I don't
anything.
understand.
But we're setting like new environmental regulations that we're going to have an international precedent. Okay, let's go down to how they talk about. Oh well, there's no guarantee that people are actually going to no economic incentive here. All right. So the point of the auction, the point of this plan is to have this set price, right? We have this base price that all companies have to pay in order to buy a apartment. And I'm sorry, I really don't have time. I'm sorry, I really don't have time. Okay. So the thing is, the point of this auction is that we have a base price, right? And we're going to have companies pay this price, and this price is high enough that they're going to move to other forms of technology. They're going to have an economic incentive to go to, for example, green technologies, which happens to be our first point. Now, what the negation team said here is that there's no guarantee that this is going to cost more. My partner says My partner says in her speech that is the point. Right now, green technology costs more than staying with fossil fuels. However, the point of this policy, of this cap and trade policy, is that we're going to raise the price of emitting enough that they move towards developing green technologies. Now, the negation team also mentioned that, well, corporations now have an incentive to outsource. Now, that's not true at all.
there's infrastructure in the U.S. that's very important to these companies. They wouldn't simply outsource. They wouldn't have that infrastructure. They wouldn't have that infrastructure if they outsource. In addition, international precedent is going to solve back for this because we see that we're going to set the precedent that China and India need in order to set harsher regulations so that companies won't actually have a motivation to outsource. They'll stay in the United States, and because they're not going to get any benefit from moving outside of the country. Yeah, it also worked in California, and there was no outsourcing. Okay, let's go on to our second contention about how cap and trade would actually help the economy. Now, the negation team says that internationally this is not successful, and they provide the example of Canada. Now, the problem with Canada was that they gave away the initial allowances instead of auctioning them off. And that's why the affirmative team's plan is going to work today. We're auctioning off these permits, which means that their companies are going to be actively competing to get these allowances. They have to bid enough money. They have to spend money on buying these allowances. So we're actually going to force them to spend money on this. And this money can go back into the economy, can help provide people education, can help provide for environmental policies. Yeah. All right. In addition, they don't refute at all that this is actually going to save money for the United States. Let's go on to our third contention about how it's easier to create an international precedent. Now, all that the negation team says here is that, well, China and India don't have any environmental regulations in the status quo. Okay, this is clearly false. As my partner stated in her point of information, they actually do have environmental policies. However, because they view the United States as hypocritical, they're actually hesitant to take another step further towards taking bigger steps like cap and trade policies. And so the United States really needs to take that step, needs to establish that precedent before China and India can go farther, can actually establish these more effective policies. Now, the negation team also seems to be under the impression that we're talking about the Kyoto Protocol when we talk about like international precedents here. We're really not. I'm sorry, no, you can't. Now, okay, yeah. So there's a lot of environmental policies that we passed this November that are actually going to be able to set this international precedent. Yeah, we've made specific agreements with China and India, and so we need to fulfill our end of those agreements for them to actually not view us as a hypocrite, for them to actually take these steps to implement new regulations. Let's move on to address the negation team's case. So first of all, I'm going to be addressing their counterplan. Judge, if you compare the affirmative team's plan versus the negation team's plan, actor, United States federal government, time frame as soon as possible, funding, normal ways and means, no funding necessary, these plans look pretty similar. This is the fact that they come up here and then spend 2 minutes bashing our plan, saying that our plan is illegitimate, that there's no way to enforce it, that's completely false. They literally do the same exact thing with their own plan. Now, in addition, another problem with their plan is that they provide no economic incentive for companies to actually reduce their emissions of these gases. And in addition, it's possible for the affirmative team to perm this plan because these plans are not mutually exclusive. You can do both of these plans at the same time. Now, it would be much better to do the perm, to have both the plan and the counter plan. The problem with doing just the counter plan is that these gases are so rare. The negation speaker says this herself, that these gases are so rare that it's not enough to just reduce them by themselves. Carbon is the one that's causing displacement of millions of people. That's going to cause sea level rise. That causes ocean acidification. That causes a lot of the major impacts that we see in environmental impacts. So it's not enough to just limit these gases on their own. Let's go on to their first contention about how it's more effective than cap and trade policy. All right, so once again, the negation team says these gases are pretty rare. So that's why we need to focus on carbon dioxide. That's why we need the perm, because we're going to be able to solve for the harms of carbon dioxide and the harms that the negation teams brings up. And for these reasons, I affirm.
I'm actually fitting everything. I'll be able to fit 3 speeches tomorrow.
Nice. Oh.
What year was the piano protocol?
1997.
actually a new one now. It expired in December 2015. They actually came together for the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, that was November. But that is not the Kyoto Protocol.
I know.
But all countries have to agree for it to be legally binding.
50%.
And there are other ones.
Is everyone ready? So as a brief time roadmap, I will first be going over the affirmative case and then the negation case. So time begins. Okay, so to address my opponent's plan, they talk about how they're going to just enact a plan through normal ways and means and no funding necessary. However, my partner pointed out there's going to be heavy enforcement issues in terms of who's going to regulate what companies are going to get what allowances. We can't leave it up to the companies who are all driven by profit to just auction off these allowances by themselves. There has to be some kind of regulation, some kind of enforcement, and this costs money. And my opponent just comes up here and says that funding is not really necessary, and like enforcement is not really necessary. However, this is untrue because what we can see is from the lack of enforcement, none of their advantages even hold any ground because without a system, we're not going to be able to incentivize clean technology or help the economy if these allowances aren't going to be auctioned off properly and carefully and without being manipulated by these larger companies. Yes?
Pray tell, what is the definition of normal ways and means?
If you say no funding,
Yeah, no funding.
I said normal ways and means. And what is normal ways and means?
taxing.
No funding, and you're just going to do an auction system. You
Just
described
say
it in
no
your own
funding.
plan.
That's a moving target. She said
No.
no funding in the
No, I
first.
said likely no funding necessary, normal ways and means. Which includes
Yeah,
if
it's
necessary.
like it's
Well,
like
they have not specified any funding, so their whole plan about 20% reduction by 2020, this is completely unrealistic. We are already in 2016. In 4 years, this plan is not going to happen. They're not going to get any 20% reduction. They have not shown any statistics in the past of a similar plan being able to achieve these goals. Moreover, they talk about setting an international precedent. However, I'd like to point out the example of the Kyoto Protocol, when this was an international agreement which really sought to improve the status of the world in terms of climate change. And however, the United States did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol even back then, showing how the United States really doesn't care about this international precedent. In fact, this international precedent does not even exist because the United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. It's therefore really not susceptible to outside pressures in terms of enacting regulations. I'll take your question at the end if I have time.
thanks.
So moving on to their first advantage about incentivizing clean technology and how this will economically be effective because of this monetary incentive. However, what my opponents fail to realize is how it discourages small businesses. They talked about in their plan is that you can buy and sell allowances. So that means that larger companies have the advantage. They are able to just either A, outsource their companies to different countries because of these regulations, or B, just simply cheat the system and just buy out allowances and keep doing whatever they're doing. And there's really no incentive for these companies to move to clean energy. And thirdly, small businesses will go out of business because they'll just be bought out by these larger businesses. So moving on, they talked about a social cost. However, this is false because actually the cost for consumers will increase if lawmakers force CO2 emission reduction. Policies, then technology is available to cost effectively transport and sequester it. The cost will actually be passed on to the consumer via higher electric rates. And so this system is much more complex than actually just regulating other greenhouse gases. So there's the social cost they talked about is really not going to go down. Moreover, we give the example of Canada of how when they enacted this cap and trade system, their emissions actually increased by 122%. So they actually did not refute this. And they just say that they gave away initial allowances, but that's exactly what their plan is doing. So it really isn't doing much. Moving on to their third advantage of international precedent, as I stated before, the United States does not care about international precedent. If the United States did care about international precedent, they would have ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And moreover, they talked about India and China viewing the United States as hypocritical and waiting for the United States to take the first step so that they can emulate the United States. This is false because India and China currently right now are reaping the benefits of our outsourced companies. They're obviously not going to want to emulate the United States in terms of its carbon regulations because if we put carbon regulations, companies will resort to outsource and go to countries like India and China, so they have no incentive to put more regulations because now they have all these new companies. Now their economy is actually just doing better. Moving on to my point about outsourcing. Oh, I'll take your question at the end. Outsourcing is actually responsible
responsible for 1/2 of the $600 billion U.S. trade deficit. So what we can see is that when these companies will get outsourced, we can see the impact of this is that the United States trade deficit will increase. This is what we've seen in the past, that CO2 emitting businesses will migrate to wherever they can save the most money, wherever like the cost of emitting is the lowest. Moreover, is that the United States outsourcing emissions. My opponent came here and talked about how outsourcing is not a thing and how like they won't resort to outsourcing if we have these CO2 regulations. However, U.S. outsourcing emissions were 282.1 million tons in 2000, and this actually increased to 441.7 million tons in 2012. So we can see is that the United States, the outsourced companies. Yeah, carbon. Yeah, tons of carbon. Okay. And this is not even with any carbon regulations that these United States companies are just going to other locations to have their businesses. So moving on to our own case, really they only talked about is how our plant is similar by normal ways and means, and how they're going to essentially perm our plant. However, I'd like to judge, I've been refuting their entire case this whole time, and clearly doing both cases at once, doing both plans at once, is not going to be effective. The reason why is because carbon regulations are just so ineffective in terms of logistically and cost effectively. We talked about the social cost to the consumer is not going to be decreased because the cost is actually going to go up because of these electricity costs. Moving on, we talked about how our greenhouse gases are obscure and rare. However, my partner talked about, in terms of climate change, these other greenhouse gases, aside from carbon, produce 1.4 watts per meter square, compared to carbon, which only produces 0.2 watts per meter square. So obviously, we can see that greenhouse gases like methane, like ozone, like CDCs, these all these other greenhouse gases that my opponents just failed to look at in their original plan, these are the ones that are having the most environmental impact. My partner cited NASA, and how, according to the NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, reductions in other greenhouse gases, examples include aerosols, CDCs, methane, ozone, is far more practical way to reduce global warming. They didn't refute any of our advantages about better irrigation management or changing the fertilizer, which is going to reduce ozone by that is an advantage. What? No. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge
arguments, man. Your plan is now also your advantage.
Your contention is it's more better. No, it's not.
The plan is also an advantage.
Wow.
Apparently.
That works.
Fancy.
It's very fancy.
Plan
You have lines. You guys, the plan text of your CP needs to be addressed,
Czarina, go.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just gonna do voters. So is everyone ready? So in baseball, 3 strikes and you're out. So today what I'm going to do is that I'm going to present the 3 strikes that my opponents have and essentially why they're out of this debate. So first off, the logistical issues. Now I'm really going to emphasize this because my opponents have consistently come up here and undermined it, but it's just a really important issue in today's debate. And they really did, I pointed out so many logical fallacies. I talked logistical issues, and I talked 2 minutes about why their plan is impossible and unrealistic, and they just said, oh, a normal ways and means. What does that even mean? We don't know. Can you stop, please? Okay. First of all, you can't just say normal ways and means. Okay, normal ways and means of raising funding is actually taxing. Okay, so you just want to increase taxes and then earn billions of dollars. That's not beneficial. And then, first of all, and then they said no funding necessary. So their entire plan has been changing based on my refutation. So really, we don't know what we're refuting at this point. But second of all, exactly, they haven't answered the myriad of questions I presented. Exactly, who's going to host these auctions to sell off these carbon bids? Who's going to monitor all of these emissions that the hundreds of thousands of millions of corporations are emitting? Who's going to enforce these spending regulations and everything? And they haven't haven't addressed the fact that there's absolutely no governmental standard whatsoever on measuring carbon emissions. So are they going to implement an entirely new one? Are these corporations going to be measuring it themselves? How do you guard against faulty self-reporting? Or maybe is the government going to go to every single corporation and every single factory in America and measure it? We don't know because, well, they just say normal ways and means. What's normal? We don't know. Okay, moving on. Is that how? Moreover, is that they talk about some arbitrary base price that is going to be high enough to incentivize the move to green technology. Can you thank you. But okay, exactly how is this going to be determined? First of all, they just set some base price, and after I came up here and said that there is no guarantee that the allowance cost is going to be greater than the cost of less emissions, then they come up with this arbitrary base price that's actually going to be this little perfect ideal number that is somehow going to incentivize all the corporations in America to go to greenhouse technology. How is it going to be determined? Exactly what is this base price? We don't know. Okay, moving on to the second stripe, which is that of outsourcing. And the fundamental thing that my opponent needs to understand is that this does cause outsourcing because really corporations and factories have no reason whatsoever to stay in America and endure higher costs when they can simply move, emit all they want, and actually have cheaper labor while they at it. It's the best of both worlds. Okay, and their only response to this is some kind of like an international precedent and how China and India have environmental regulations and how they're like scared because they see United States as a hypocrite. Okay, there's like two fallacies with this. There's the two problems with this argument. First of all, it logically doesn't really make sense since China and India are the countries reaping the benefits from the from U.S. corporations outsourcing. So why exactly would they try and prevent this outsourcing? But secondly, they have no guarantee whatsoever that China and India are going to be implementing these environmental statistics. So really, this pattern remains that there's just arbitrary idealist like conjectures that they really have no proof whatsoever. And moreover, there's actually other countries in the world that the United States corporations can outsource to. For example, Mexico, like China and India, even if
Point
they
of order.
order to.
The argument that the U.S. would outsource to Mexico instead is entirely new in the
Okay,
last
outsourcing has
decade.
been made. It's just like a specific like thing. Like honestly, this isn't a contention. It's not
Under consideration by the judge.
Ooh, can I decide?
Sure.
I consider
Like, can
this
you,
as I consider this as like an example, but it is new information about Mexico.
Okay, okay,
so
fine.
it's like an
Okay,
example.
Mexico exists. Okay. There are certain other countries that can't be named in this debate that the United States corporations can outsource to. Apparently, my opponents seem to think United States, Canada, and China and India are the only 4 countries in the world. No, okay. So moving on, just like a clarification. And the real tangible effects of this outsourcing is going to be millions of jobs lost. CO2 emissions will remain the same, only hurting other people. Can you thank you. Only hurting other people in the world, and we're going to have this logistical nightmare that who knows is going to have to deal with because really they have no answer. Okay. So moving on to their third and final strike, and it's that of our counter plan. Now, okay, so they just come up here and they said, Judge, our plans are really similar. Great job for noticing that. Good one. So, actually, and then they say that like the reduction of other greenhouse gases are not enough. Actually, as I already said, according to the NASA Goddard Institute, it's actually 7 times more effective than simply reducing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide emissions through their plan is going to be this logistical nightmare where the government has to fund billions and billions and billions of dollars trying to regulate corporations. Corporations move away. The United States economy suffers an implosion. But with ours, it's all governmentally regulated and just kept within government regulations. What we're going to do is that we're simply going to be repairing natural gas lines, thus creating a 30% reduction in methane. It's so, can you thank you. Okay, so it's incredibly easy, and I don't really see, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to do this cap and trade program that nobody knows about, because there's an entire arbitrary cap and trade program, when we could just go the easy route and then move on to reducing 30%. It's actually grace period, but that's fine. I see that my opponents are really nervous if I continue talking. Their somewhat non-existent case will crumble even further. So, as you can see, the choice is clear. Please move it. Alright. I'm going to go brief overview.
Okay.
Then,
Your partner was laughing at you.
yeah, your partner was. And then over some voter issues.
Alright, how's it? So overview on the voter issues.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Are you
I'll
going to do some
put stuff on
reputation
the
to
flow,
voters?
but you can flow it on the flow if you feel like. I'll go in order or try to.
Yeah, I'll try.
Is everyone ready? Yeah. Alright. Time starts now. I once again strongly affirm today's resolution.
the negation team will be losing today's round because they have not refuted the perm. All they say against the perm is that the plan is going to be ineffective. Okay, first of all, it is not ineffective. Second of all, even if it is ineffective, that is not a reason to vote against the perm. Even if the plan does absolutely nothing, there's no reason not to do it anyways, seeing as how they have proven absolutely no detriments, as I'll get into later, as this outsourcing thing is simply not going to happen. So we see because they have not refuted the perm, there is no reason to vote for the counterplan alone instead of both the plan and the counterplan, which has a much higher probability of solving for global warming. Which brings me to my first voter issue, looking at this whole logistical nightmare thing. Now, first of all, normal ways and means is the generally accepted way in Parley to get around talking about government regulation, government agencies, bureaucracy, etc. Why? Because Parley isn't about talking about how you create a government agency. Parley is about talking about the impacts of these plans. That is why there's something called fiat. Fiat and normal ways and means are why we don't talk about this stuff, and rather talk about the impacts of the policies. So when we say normal ways and means, just like my opponents here used in their counterplan, we assume that there's the government regulation, agencies, and enforcement necessary for this to actually happen. When they say ours is a logistical nightmare, they ignore the fact that if ours is, theirs most certainly is too, because we both rely on this normal means, both for any funding necessary, which I did say in my first speech, as well as for any sort of enforcement. So we see this has absolutely no offense whatsoever for either sides, and it's not even a point in the round. Secondly, looking at any potential detriments to the affirmative plan. In other words, what they're saying about outsourcing. Now, they talk over and over and bringing up how there's cheaper labor in other countries. Well, if there's already cheaper labor, why haven't they already gone there? The answer? Infrastructure here in the United States. As my partner brought up and my opponents declined to refute, there is infrastructure within the United States that makes it much less profitable to move overseas unless there are prohibitively high tax rates. Now, we are not increasing taxes. So we see that these companies have no reason whatsoever to move to another country versus just making the small cost-effective changes within their own policies to reduce their carbon emissions so they no longer have to pay for excess allowances. So we see, in fact, that this will be effective, and there's no reason, based on this idea of infrastructure here in the United States that is not available, whether it be China, India, Mexico, any other country within the world, it's not going to happen. Secondly, they failed to refute the fact that California implemented a policy like this.
Mexico could not be mentioned.
You said it.
No, I said some nations.
Point not well taken. Move
Or-
on.
You move on. She can do that if she wants to. They failed
Not
to
well
refute
taken.
the fact that that California implemented a policy like this, and yet we saw absolutely no outsourcing from California to anywhere else within the United States or anywhere else worldwide. So sure, maybe the carbon emissions in other countries have increased. That doesn't mean we're outsourcing more. It just means the companies in other nations are emitting carbon, whereas ones in the United States might be marginally more effective right now. So we see that through these examples, outsourcing is clearly not going to be a problem, because these companies are going to stay in the United States. Additionally, with the issue of international precedent, we see that these will be solved back for. It's not the fact that the United States doesn't have a precedent right now. That's not the point. The point is that we don't, so we should set one. And establishing this policy would do exactly that, and set the precedent that currently does not exist, as my opponents so graciously point out that we didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol. Yes, we didn't. That's why we should set a precedent now. As well as the fact that India and China have stated in their bilateral agreements with the United States that while they are obligated to reduce these emissions, they're not going to do it unless the U.S. does. So if we're doing it, that means they're going to do it, which means we get overall more benefits of reducing global warming, reducing...
Can I point of order? Yeah.
I mean, it's not new.
The bilaterals were never mentioned.
Yeah,
We
that
mentioned
was
agreements
actually
with
mentioned.
China and
No,
India.
But it was never bilateral.
Jesus
An
Christ.
agreement between the United States and China. That is two countries, thus that is bilateral.
Where did you
Just
see
learn some
Where
definitions.
was India?
U.S. and
Oh
India.
my
U.S.
god.
and China. They are separate.
This isn't mentioned in the first speech itself. I mean, sorry, refutations. This isn't mentioned.
It's not my fault.
It was refuted.
Yeah, it's not our fault you didn't listen to us. Anyways, moving on. So we see that this will in fact create far more benefit overall for preventing these horrible effects of climate change. Now moving on to my third voter issue, looking at that of the perm. Now their only disadvantages to our plan are outsourcing and logistical nightmares. I have refuted both of those, thus there are no disadvantages to the plan. And as all they've said is there's no guarantee it will work, and it will discourage small businesses. First of all, small businesses are less likely to emit as much carbon because they are small businesses. Second of all, the fact that we are creating the base price of carbon and auctioning them off immediately instead of giving them away. Their argument rests on the fact that we're giving them away, when we're not. So we see that the perm resolves all of these issues, helps to deal with methane, but more importantly with carbon. Because yes, methane in small amounts might be worse compared to the same amount of carbon, but there's a lot more carbon in the atmosphere. Thus it's clear that you will be voting on the perm because that solves for all of these effects of global warming. With this, I strongly affirm.
Ooh, do I get to give feedback now?
Sure.
Alright, okay. I'll just go after.
Guys, calm down so you can
I'll go through each speech, and then Lily will cover whatever I missed, which is probably the important stuff. Okay. Let's go. Okay, so, first speaker, a.k.a. Lily. Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's okay, you can go me first. She's talking to them.
Yes.
Oh yeah, you did good job on like explaining everything. I loved your contention, but like just saying like if this is like a lay round, I feel like your plan text could be. I know like most people like how do I explain this? Consider me as a lay parent, not hearing about the carbon tax. Like I get the auction, I get how you're gonna. I get the basic idea, but like for at least for lay, just go more detail, cause like. They're just gonna want to know, but like it's partly so you don't have enough time. But yeah, just like something just.